Thank you ever so much for listening to this Happy Times and Places, a positively inclined Doctor Who episode commentary podcast in which I, Toby Haydoke, watch a Doctor Who story nominated by a friend of mine and see if I can spot what their favourite thing about each episode might be.
Hi Toby, I'm Steve Lyons. I'm a writer of Doctor Who and some other stuff, and I would like to challenge you to watch the Sensorites.
Oh, well, hello, everyone. It's sadly not a happy time as I record this between watching episodes 1 and 2 of The Sensorites for this podcast. The news has come in yesterday as I record this of the death of William Russell, a.k.a. Russell Enoch, a.k.a. Ian Chatterton, Chesterfield, Chesterton. Oh, there was something I thought rather wonderful about the fact that somebody who was, a grown man, a middle-aged man, really, when he was the sort of de facto hero of the first episode of Doctor Who, was still with us. It sort of proved that anything was possible. I like the idea of being able to go, well, yeah, he's still around, and we've talked to him recently, and all of that sort of thing, and the fact that he, continued to have an excellent career. I've been watching some other bits and bobs of his today, and boy, he was so good. A lovely clip of him in something called Parkin's Patch with John Flanagan, writer of Meglos, and Gareth Thomas Blake, where he's a sort of ex-prisoner who's, been up to something no good, but not awfully no good, but he's being a bit shifty about it, but also a bit vulnerable, and the police are quite heavy on him, and it's a lovely little turn in this small clip I saw on Twitter. But of course, seen him in all sorts of other things, and he was a great man of the stage. I've got loads of Royal Shakespeare Company programmes where in between sort of 80s mostly, late 70s, 80s, where he was, doing fine work, playing excellent roles for the Royal Shakespeare Company. And so, a proper actor who had a proper career. He wasn't just Doctor Who's William Russell. I know there's nothing just about that, but I always like it when our heroes achieve something outside of the world of Doctor Who, because I think they deserve to. And much as I love Doctor Who, I sometimes think people are sort of tarnished by being that person from that program that has a cult following, because it sometimes, I think, takes the shine off their achievements elsewhere. But nothing could take the shine off his. He was a busy, accomplished actor. He's even in The Great Escape, which is another thing I love. And I had the pleasure. He was a charming fellow. He wasn't the easiest person to interview and commentate with, really, because he was, he just enjoyed it all. Really, he didn't give a massive amount of insight, I didn't think. That wasn't really his style. He was more just sort of reveling in it and enjoying it, and enjoying the memories. But he was absolutely class and a charming fellow. I actually first met him when he was backstage at Hamlet. I think I mentioned that last week. So wasn't I lucky at the Grand Theatre, Wolverhampton, in the corridor between the stage door and the outside world? I met him, and I met John from the Sensorites, both on the same night. That was the first time, but I had the pleasure of meeting William Russell several times subsequently, and so well loved, and what a lovely character he has. I think Ian is so brilliant. I just think he's so delightful. He's charming, but he's so important there to sell the realism of the drama. He keeps it very, very grounded. But then he's light and delightful when he needs to be. But, when he needs to turn it on. And let's not forget, the people of his generation served in the war. They saw action. Didn't talk about it much, and yet, that generation were people who, when they had to do things that would give some of us PTSD just thinking about it, they did it and they got on with it, and they still managed to be people with, manners, with charm, with unflappability. Much is talked about all the terrible things about the past that we've rightly changed and moved on from. But I think stoicism, unflappability, courtesy, various other things that were around in those days that aren't so much anymore, I think we should equally mourn the loss of. And also point out that, not everything was bad back then, and there are some things from back then that we could do with recapturing, and the spirit of William Russell, I think, is one of those things. So it will be interesting for me watching this with that in mind. I probably won't be able to take my eyes off him, watching him there, clear as a bell, with the knowledge that he has recently left us. I know he hadn't been very well, and I think he'd been struggling for some time. But a shame he didn't notch up that great 100. That would have been a real achievement. But 99 ain't bad. So let's see how well. First off, it's when I posted on my Patreon that I'd done episode 1, and I gave it a sort of how are we going to cope with this one write-up? Although, of course, I knew I'd coped with episode 1 very well. But, to get people in the mood, I was like, Sensorites, it's a tricky one. And a lot of people, I think, before they'd heard that actually I really enjoyed episode 1, were sort of reacted to that to go, no, actually, it's great. Although Keith didn't. Keith just went, eek. And I pointed out, oh, well, no, actually, I liked it. And he said, on my grand rewatch, I quite enjoyed it. I struggled through the next story, though, but then it was fine, more or less. You struggled with the next story, did you? That's... no, so did I. Frank Shell says, in many ways, this story is the template for The Ambassadors of Death, which is the previous story that I have done on Happy Times and Places, which I adore and which is terribly underrated. It's essentially a first contact tale, says Frank, with misunderstandings driven by the motives of an unhinged mission leader survivor of an earlier encounter with friendly aliens he now believes were malign, and almost causes a genocidal war as a result of playing factions against each other whilst remaining undetected. Do you know what? I would not have made that connection, Frank, and I think that is bang on. Isn't that funny? And that's certainly not, not deliberate placing on my part, and I wouldn't have made that connection, I don't think. I'd have probably just gone on about the other things John Bailey was in. That's probably what I'll do in episode 6, but that's a delight we've got to look forward to. Kazin says, I'll go to bat for the Sensorites. I'd much rather watch it than the Keys of Marinus or the Reign of Terror. It's 2 bits of not a lot of love for the Reign of Terror we've just had. Now, who's doing Reign of Terror for this? I definitely don't have the contribution for it, but somebody has claimed it. I wonder who that is. Yes, it can be a bit of a slog at various points, but I like the visual design of the Sensorites themselves. I like Susan getting something to do. I like the tension of the first 2 episodes a good deal. It has merit. Well, yeah, and I did enjoy episode 1, so we'll see how we do. David Gillespie Pratt says the cliffhanger is really effective here as well. The Sensorite at the spaceship window. It's a shame that the restage for episode 2, he's a lot less sinister looking. We're just about to have that, David. I think it's the hands on the window that make it more menacing. Now, we have a more recent correspondent who backs that up. We'll get to that at the end of this set of readings of correspondence. Ben Cowdell says, looking for Peter is certainly your magnum opus. Oh, this is about my documentary. Of a sort I look forward to continuing when I finally get the Blu-rays. Sensorites is one of those cerebral attempts that only a minority supports. Others go for a more juicy offering. Season 1 would be poorer without Sensorites, though. Yeah, it's a nice way of looking at it, Ben. Good luck, Toby, you'll need it, says Paul. Watched it the other day, grown to like it more. First 2 episodes are great, says Anthony Carroll. Yeah, my feeling has always been that the first 2 episodes have been fine, and in fact, I thought episode 1 was really terrific. So I'll be interested to see how we do later on. Joe McLachlan says, I have a lot of affection for the Sensorites. I might claim it's the only story where Carol Ann Ford has anything to do, but I think my like of it also comes from the fact that I really enjoyed the things I learned about making telly back in the day, with the result cliffhanger and Jacqueline Hill's I think that means the restaged cliffhanger and Jacqueline Hill's holiday. It's the first story that really made me consider some of the practicalities of these things. That's very interesting. Yes, we all have those where we suddenly realise you can look behind the curtain and, oh my God, how much more to Doctor Who is there? And the behind the scenes stuff has always been just as interesting to me as what goes on screen, if not more so, actually. Guy Lambert, cool in a cardigan. There's your next show title. Christopher Joyce says, this was a wonderful episode. Stephen Moffat promoting Boom said that Doctor Who didn't do suspense often, but this episode is sustained suspense throughout. I wonder if I was alone in shouting at the telly for the Doctor to stop pontificating and return to the TARDIS when the lock was being stolen. Michael Herbert says, thanks, Toby. Looking forward to the rest of the episodes. I just enjoyed the episode. That's nice. And it's Chris Williams who picks up on the point made earlier. So Chris says, watched this one last night as I wanted to watch a William Russell episode, so why not part one of the Sensorites? Well, I thought the cliffhanger may have been a choice here, as it's pretty creepy, especially if you're one of those people who suffer from a fear of seeing a horrible face at the window looking in at you, especially at night. I don't think there's a specific name for it, but I do remember Charlie Brooker writing a piece about it years ago. It probably manifests more in those of us who grew up watching Salem's Lot, the Joan Collins section of the Tales from the Crypt portmanteau horror film, or worst of all, the Ian McKellen episode of Armchair Thriller with a bloody face suddenly pressed up against a train window at night. I was 8 when I saw that, and I still think about it now. So I think that ending probably caused a few sleepless nights back in 1964. I think that's a fair point, Chris, and I have to say, I hope I wasn't too... I like the hands on the window. I like the round... I like the concept of the creature in space as well, outside the spaceship. That's all rather fun and creepy. And I suppose, yeah, and it's partially because it, as I say, it changes this week and isn't quite so good, I think. But maybe I was rude about it last week. I didn't mean to be. I quite like it as an episode ending. I think I probably just wanted to say the Sensorite looked like Dr. Snuggles, and then this week say he looks like Papa Smurf. But I've blown that now, haven't I? Anyway, let's get on. Steve Lyons will be on hand. Brilliant writer, Steve Lyons, writer of some of the best and wittiest Doctor Who fiction. He also, with Chris Howarth, interviewed people for Doctor Who magazine and wrote the completely useless encyclopedia. There's a couple of them, actually, in those days when you were allowed to be funny about Doctor Who. Okay, and people didn't think unique. Yeah, anyway. Right, so I am going to watch on iPlayer. I am going to watch episode 2 of the Sensorites, which is called The Unwilling Warriors. And we're going to press play. And oh, by the way, apologies if you can hear lots of sort of bubbles and things. My stomach is going doolally, but it's purely interior rumbling. I wouldn't be doing what the noise my chair makes sometimes suggests I'm doing. I would desist, but there's some sort of there's something bubbling away inside my old tum, and I can only apologise for that. I've been trying to eat very healthily, you know, but perhaps that's why. Perhaps my stomach's going, I'm used to the rubbish you normally throw down you. Right, let us press play in 3, 2, 1. I'm sure I say it every time, but I love these opening titles, and I always think there's something rather sort of mysterious about the fact that the thing we associate with being the very first part of Doctor Who we ever see was actually made for another programme. And if you're interested in the provenance of the various bits of signal howl round that are in the opening titles of the very first Doctor Who episodes, then there is a Too Much Information podcast where I go into great detail about them for the beginnings of the show. I love, actually, we complain sometimes, it is noted that 60s Who is perhaps a trifle slow for a modern audience, but I like the languid pace sometimes. Sometimes I want to watch something that unfolds a bit more like the storybooks I read as a kid, and they don't need to... Actually, the way he rises, then, I'd imagine that, because I don't think it's as good as the first one, I'd imagine that to be a bit rubbish. I think I'd got in my head that he's just sort of standing there with, slightly bad posture just sort of like he's just sort of lounging, but he actually sort of rose up. Then it was almost a bit like he was on a sort of platform, and those dark eyes are are pretty spooky. And this is probably in better quality than I'm used to watching it, because of course the majority of times I've watched this have been on, scrappy. Well, relatively scrappy. I mean, they were always decent quality, these serials, when I had them from the first couple of seasons, but not the quality that we have them now. And actually that was a much better opening to the episode than I'd remembered. But I think it's because I always remember it in comparison to the previous episode, which is a much better version of that cliffhanger, and that is because, and it's partially because it's a different Sensorite, because the Sensorites that they had doing it last week, they were paying a walk-on to play, which is different from paying a featured actor, and that's what the guys this week are: Ken Tilson and Joe Gregg, as opposed to Anthony Rogers last week. Poor old, he does look like David Tennant, doesn't he, Stephen Dartnell? And this is really creepy. That he's having a conversation, and rather a distressed conversation, with these unseen forces. Now, although we do now know they look a bit like Papa Smurf, although had he been invented then? I don't know if he had. I only remember the Smurfs being from the 1980s. I'm sure there's a Smurfs podcast yesterday that can trouble itself with that. So, have I missed something, or is that mark on the door showing him where he should be cutting, or have they tried something with that before? If not, and I can't remember because it's been a long week, and I don't know the Sensorites as well as I might know other stories, but if that mark's there to show Lorne Cossette where to do his cutting, I think they could have hidden it slightly better. But I'm sure there's an excuse for that, because otherwise I would have read it in goofs somewhere, and it doesn't strike me as such. So maybe I've gone down a blind alley. Slowly, but it's working, because it's already been cut before. I do like the round design of the various doors and portholes on this ship. Ray Cusick was a very imaginative. Not the cheeriest of fellows, but a very imaginative designer. They want me to frighten you. That's a really spooky concept, isn't it? And the idea of a sort of mental assault is something that is not unusual in sort of 60s. Oh, she's so. I love the way that they really try and reassure him. I think that's really good, and it is a riposte to the idea that Doctor Who's female companions are sort of flapping and hopeless. And I know Doctor Who's female companions can sometimes be flapping and hopeless, but here they're really kind to John, and they're looking after him, and they're concerned for his welfare, even if it means they have to not entirely be honest with him. Yay, it's the Sensorites, and one's just stood on the other one's foot. But I think there's a really nice attempt here to do something different. I think the fact, and even in this good quality, because I know that the bad quality helped back in the day, where you couldn't see, the eyes behind the mask, but actually it's good enough, and it's a simple enough thing. The human eye is far back enough within the mask for the Sensorite eyes to look like sort of large black irises in a way, but they're mysterious. You can't quite read them, and in the same way that you can't quite read a robotic face, that can be disconcerting. But obviously these aren't robots. These are beings who are capable of much less robotic conversation, and their physiognomies are more organic. So they're not odd in the same way that it's odd talking to a robot, because they're odd because they're slightly indistinct. And this is great. This is very unlike what Doctor Who has given us up to this point. You have a battle on a mental front, being led by the two female companions who are have worked all this out on their own in the company of a stricken male. I have this photo. I bought this photo from John McElroy at a Doctor Who convention, and it was, it's a slightly scratched picture. It wasn't restored or anything like that, but I like that. That even added to it. And I have that somewhere in a photo album, rather large. They cost quite a lot, those photos, for somebody who was only spending sort of, Saturday job money. But I got it. Carol's hair's extraordinary, isn't it? We don't really see those sort of beehive type things with ladies' hairs anymore, because Carol's got big hair. Barbara's got big hair as well. We don't do big hair in that way anymore. And he's not. I mean, we think of Hartnell as being crotchety, and he does get cross in this story quite a lot. But he's very sweet with Carol. And Susan looks, troubled there. This is a great joke. Do you know his hair's gone almost white? Nothing wrong with that, says Doctor Who, with his white hair, with his wig, which I hadn't realised Hartnell wore a wig for years. This is an odd thing. This reminds me a bit of the bit in the Reign of Terror where Ian goes, something about a sinking ship. What was it about a sinking ship? Oh yes, the sinking ship. And here we've got which actually he doesn't hear in the story. He just tells us about it. And now we've got Ian come and report something that has happened off screen. And seeing as it's a story that is fairly low on incident, it's interesting that they've given this to Ian to report back to the Doctor rather than have us here, present with Ian when John does it. I mean, it's always a bit hokey when people say key things in their sleep. Bill Filer has a particularly egregious example of that in episode 3 of The Claws of Axos. But I must not distribute bad words about other Doctor Who stories, and I love The Claws of Axos. That gets a bad press. Anyway, look, I think these Sensorites look great. I love the fact that they've gone to the effort of giving them all slightly different hair arrangements. And I love the fact that they're softly spoken. But yes, that Rich Beyond the Dreams of Avarice, it's a slightly odd way of getting Ian and the Doctor and everybody to work out what the situation is with the humans and the sensory, to go, oh, this bloke's just said this thing in his sleep. Oh, yes, and this is Doctor Who being this is the science bit, isn't it? Yes, and of course, Susan showing that she's still an unearthly child. It's a good couple of episodes, this, for Susan, and she gets quite a lot to do, as we'll see later on. And there's a beautiful 60s sincerity about that, isn't there? You're very strange, people. The Doctor is already sort of the lead. Then they've said that the Doctor leads. Isn't it better to travel hopefully than to arrive? Ah, yes. That's a well-known saying. It's Robert Louis Stevenson, isn't it? And I like that idea that, and actually, some could say there are certain Doctor Who writers who prefer the journey than the arrival, who feel that the way you get to the climax is perhaps more important than the climax itself. I mean, interesting with the Sensorites, I think it's when they're not travelling at the beginning and when they arrive at the end are the most interesting bits. It's the bits in the middle that are the issue. Well, we'll see. It may be I have to go into the later episodes with a sense of positivity. But, it is philosophically quite interesting, isn't it, to say, well, and that's kind of what I do with this, is I try and put myself in a hopeful, in an optimistic, a positive piece of frame of mind in order to enjoy the journey through these Doctor Who episodes. And, travelling, hopefully, hope, gives you expectation, and expectation is often actually much better than the experience once you get to it. So I like that idea of travelling, hopefully being I mean, there's quite a few series, I haven't watched the last episode of. This Life, Sharp. I've enjoyed the journey, and I didn't want it to come to an end. So yes, it is better to travel, hopefully, than to arrive. Molybdenum. I wasn't a great fan of science at school. I'm not a natural scientist. I didn't have an aptitude for it. But when we were doing the periodic table, if we had to choose one to write about or learn, or I'd always choose molybdenum, simply because I'd read that it was an important element of the plot of the Sensorites. And of course, anything that linked to Doctor Who was more interesting to me than something that didn't. So if there was an element on the periodic table that was mentioned in an old Doctor Who story, then that was as close. I mean, I'm sorry, young people, but sometimes that was as close as we might get to actually watching these adventures. I know they're all available now on your computers and your hand phones and your smart devices, but in those days, just being in science and reading about molybdenum made me feel one step closer to the Sensorites, which of course I would never ever see. This is one of the sort of famous instances, isn't it, of them being told, you have to walk very slowly around this set because it's quite small. And William Russell, very cleverly, bless him, doesn't just walk very slowly. He stops, he pauses, he's adding drama to it. Then he's going, hang on, hang on, have I heard something? Wait a minute, Barbara, you wait, you come here. He's so they've said slow it down, and he's gone, yeah, I'll slow it down, but I'm going to throw lots and lots of bits of action into this. I think that you could see that section of the wall move there slightly. The flap in the set. But yeah, and he's acting the whole thing with this sort of inscrutable seriousness. He's being brave. He's conveying the danger without looking scared, but he's serious. He means business. Oh, look at the way. So you needn't come if you don't want to. He could easily have done that, of going, you needn't come. Well, I'm being a bit holding you back, woman. But instead, he's gone for a completely different approach, which is to say the line, which still has the same meaning. You don't have to come. This is a scary mission. But he flashes such a charming smile. It's charming. That is what I keep coming back to with these early Hartnell episodes, is that the dynamic between the regulars is so charming. These are great. Look at those masks. Look at the black eyes that you can't make out. And they're being, it's yeah, everyone's just a bit cautious and a bit slow. But of course, Ian is brave. He means business. If it means he's got to grab a space wrench, he's gonna grab it. But I mean, and the Sensorites, I think, are successful because they don't look scary, but they don't look unscary. It's not like they're having to work hard to go, oh, we're gonna have to work really hard to suggest to the viewer that these things might be malevolent, because they are strange looking. They've got those enlarged craniums, and there's a bald, scary looking monster. Is it a space vampire or something on the closing credits of the original Star Trek that always reminded me a bit of this guy's? It's obviously a bit scarier. It's got sharper lines, and I think it's got quite a scary expression on its face. But it's got the similar sort of bald, enlarged cranium, and it's and the fact that they keep coming and they're not saying anything, I think this is really quite effective. It wasn't so good one stood on the other's foot when we first saw them, but the fact that they're not saying anything, I think, is quite unsettling and a bit odd. And the fact that they just keep coming, because that eventually it's going to get to the point where he's got to stop them, or they've got to come through him. I think this is really good, and I think Norman Kay's music really helps to sell it as well. Come on, John, you come and sort them out. Oh, bless him. But yes, the idea of mental assault, I think, is... I was going to say is not one we get later in Doctor Who. People do get taken over and things like that, but this idea of sort of being attacked from a distance in the mind, I think that's really quite scary because they don't have to be in the room with you. There's something. He's a bit like Renfield, isn't he, John? He's the person who's encountered the creature and it's made him sort of lose his mind. Oh, good work, Ian. What's he doing? So the Sensorites can get through this. He's very good, isn't he? Yeah. So that was a bit of sort of cheated drama, but that's absolutely fine. And they're making. I mean, they've covered every inch of this set, but it doesn't feel. As I say, the famous story is that they were told to move slowly around the set because it wasn't that big. It doesn't feel like a cramped spaceship. I think it feels like a spaceship that does the job that it's designed to do. And we've seen various different sections of it, so I think Mervyn Pinfield's done a good job. I think these guys look great. I mean, nowadays you'd probably have, buffer actors and, either leather or that sort of rubbery stuff. Yeah, you'd probably have it so you could see their ribs, wouldn't you? And that they'd have nipples probably, or certainly sexy man tits. But I say bring back the portly actor playing aliens. I don't think everyone has to be sexy and ribbed and aerodynamic, and sleek and precision engineered. But there is something quaint about the fact you've got these slightly sort of loose-fitting cloth felty costumes. But I actually think they're a successful creation. And, of course, this whole story is about presenting an alien race that turn out to be benign. And this early in, I think that's a triumph. Not only are they benign, but they also communicate in a way different from how we're used to being communicated. They are a bit like the Ood, aren't they, with the doodads? But also we have the fact that Carol Ann Ford gets to do creepy alien acting because she's got that misty alien face thing going on, and she's great at doing that otherworldly kind of misty-eyed thing. And I think they move a little bit in unison there. Joe Gregg and Ken Tilson. Joe was a funny little Scottish man. And in fact, I'll let you into a secret. This was the first episode we did in the commentary. We were supposed to be doing it in order, but somebody who we'd scheduled for episode 1 hadn't arrived, and so we started with episode 2. And I was really looking forward to this because I'd not met Joe before. We'd got William Russell and Carol Ann Ford. We'd got Ray Cusick. We'd got Sonia Markham. And then I knew we were going to get refreshed at the end with Frank Cox coming in, and who's the director. And we'd got the two humans actors later. So I thought we'd got a real good mixture of people. And it was a long day because we had Colony in Space to do as well. So 12 episodes I commentated on that day. But I was optimistic because nobody talked much about the Sensorites. I thought we were really gonna have a good go at this, and it started, and I said, and they said, we said, right, so I'll introduce it, and then I'll hand over to you, and you introduce yourselves, and then let's go. That's what we always say. So I went, hello, it's Toby Haydock here, commentating on episode 2 of the Sensorites, and of course you have to cheat it slightly because. You're not introducing it for the first time, so I had to sort of pass off the fact that we hadn't done episode 1 yet and sort of go, and so-and-so is back with us, or whatever it was I said. And I said, and we're joined by, I looked over at Joe Gregg, and he was just, and he'd been perfectly lucid and fun and knew what he was there for. But then just when everything was turned on, people suddenly changed. They really do. And I went, we're joined by Joe. And he sort of looked at me and I said, it's Joe Gregg. And, as I say, they'd been primed to sort of say, I'm Joseph Gregg, and I played second Sensorite or whatever. And I love that image of Hartnell being sharp and them having to cover their ears and their little mousy things. And I said, it's Joe Gregg. So I'm already going, well, this has gone wrong. We'll probably have to re-record this bit. And he went, what? And I said, how are you today, Joe? I thought, let's get anything to get us started. He said, I'm not going to tell you. And I was like, oh, right, okay. And then we sort of went on, and we did have to re-record. I'm afraid the opening of episode 2 and the introduction of Joe Gregg is re-recorded. So there we go, a little peek behind the curtain. And that was the beginning of, I have to confess, quite a long day. I worked bloody hard during the commentary for the Sensorites, so forgive me if this happy times and places, if I occasionally just grind to a halt in despair, because it won't be the first time, I can tell you. But I actually think it turned out pretty well. But it was nobody was really on my side, I would say, until I think Frank Cox came in on episode 4. Everyone had their own. William Russell, God bless him, I think had the certain things that he wanted to say, and I thought this was a really interesting. A friend of mine had primed me that William Russell was really interested in politics, and he was a really liberal guy, and that he might be interested in engaging in political questions, and so I thought, well, this is a good story to do that. And I said to him, what do you think of Doctor Who's politics? William, is it, it's sort of liberal, isn't it? And this story with the benign aliens, did you like it? And he just kind of didn't want to engage with that at all. He'd got the things that he'd sort of come to say, and he really enjoyed it, but he wasn't interested in engaging sort of much beyond that. And that's not a criticism, but it did mean some things that I thought would be refreshing about the commentary as I'd anticipated it were not. Ray Cusick, I would say, was quite difficult to get too much joy out of. So yeah, it was I'd thought, this was territory that hadn't been covered much, so therefore people would enjoy covering it in a novel way. And let's say I think I was perhaps more enthusiastic than everybody else that day. Oh, long day. But yes, I love this image. I think this shot of Susan, and Hartnell's eyes as well. I love the way that when he sort of squints with that sort of darting intelligence that he's got, really creepy, like a creaking door, that music. And I think that's a terrific image. The shot of Susan, the fact that she's been communing with them in a psychic way, and then that the door is shut, and she says, "They'll kill me if you don't." Sorry, I sort of I ventured into anecdote territory there for the last part of the episode, but I fear that might have to be the case occasionally with the Sensorites. I listened to the delightful Gary Russell on the delightful Joe Ford's Hamster with a Blunt Penknife commentary on the Sensorites, and they hardly talk about what's going on screen at all. It's a fascinating commentary, but everyone seems to avoid talking about the Sensorites. So actually, note to self, come on, Toby, engage with what you see, which I promise I will do in episodes 3, 4, 5, and 6. But perhaps I should have saved my Joe Gregg anecdote, my DVD commentary anecdote, for later. Oh, well, never mind. What is my favourite thing about episode 2 of the Sensorites? Is it Susan getting to do her psychic powers thing? I do like that. I think it's a terrific cliffhanger. I do. I think it's a really nice cliffhanger, but I think the fact that we get Susan being a bit of an unearthly child. I love the image of the Doctor sort of, he doesn't even yell at them. He sort of snaps at them and them covering their ears. I really think the Sensorite mask designs are rather wonderful. And I think they are a really strange and offbeat presence. They're like sort of space moles, aren't they? Or sort of little space shrews who live in a library. I think they're charming, but they're odd, and they could be scary, or they're difficult to read, and that's because they commune telepathically rather than speaking, or certainly at the start of our encounters with them. I do like the Doctor's line about there's nothing wrong with that, my hair turning white. But I think it's the fact that Susan gets something to do that echoes the alien qualities that she exhibited so well in the first episode of the series, full stop, and has got to do less and less, and which obviously we know leads to her leaving, and I think is maybe something to do with the format at that time, and they needed a kid to get into trouble, but she's much more interesting, and I think Carol Ann Ford is much better when she gets to channel that slightly weird space kid vibe that she does so well, that suits her diction, it suits her physiognomy, it suits her vibe, and I love that image of her going off at the end. I love the fact that she sort of takes control of the situation. Hartnell was great in that episode as well. I mean, I could just say the regulars, couldn't I? I could say William Russell being all brave and brilliant, and making a virtue of the fact that he's been told to move around the set very slowly. The black and white, the fact it's all in black and white and it's really moodily done, and actually the slow pace, that languidness that is, slightly eerie and unsettling. But I'm gonna go for Susan Foreman, Carol Ann Ford being able to do the weird space thing, the weird psychic space child thing that she does so well. And remember, keen listeners on, how well I score this stuff, I'm currently in the lead, so watch me throw it away. As Steve psychically knows, I was going to say Susan being psychic and has chosen something completely different.
Episode 2 of the Sensorites is the Unwilling Warriors, and my favourite thing in this episode is the whole sequence where Ian and Barbara are menaced by a couple of Sensorites aboard the spaceship. It's played differently to most episodes. In most episodes of Doctor Who, this would all have been screaming and running, but here the scene is played much more slowly. There's much more suspense in it. It just seems much more menacing, and I think it's really effective.
Yeah, that is a good choice, and maybe I should have chosen that as well because it had William Russell. But Steve wasn't going to know that. He recorded this 100 years ago. But yeah, it is a really good scene, and again, why it's a good scene, irrespective of the fact that it's staged quite eerily and the Sensorite actors do their job very well. They are slightly menacing and slightly weird. The fact that the writer hasn't given them anything to say, which is a bit disconcerting, and the fact that then the camera is on two fabulous actors, William Russell and Jacqueline Hill, who just have to act, and there's no, you can't cut away from them. You can't sweep the camera to one side. You can't give it chippy choppy this in the edit or anything like that. So you have to rely on your actors. This is how important actors are to Doctor Who, full stop, but particularly Sictor's Doctor Who, when there weren't edits. There weren't scenes pieced together later. It was a continuous performance, and your actors had to be up to it. They could not drop the ball. And in this scene particularly, where the camera is basically following them very slowly as they retreat from a couple of old men in sock, with paper plates on their feet, and slightly saggy body stockings, but it works. Partially because the aliens are, despite what I've just said, are actually an effectively strange presence, but also because those two actors know exactly what is required of them, and that the burden on conveying the drama is on the weight that they give to the situation. But as well as that, they're having to do a practical thing, which is move slowly because they've been told to, because the space is limited. And I think it's an absolute triumph. But it's a great scene. It's great stuff. And yeah, as Steve says, there's no big jumps or scares or anything like that. It's slower. It's languid. It's weird. I love 60s Doctor Who for being weird. Doctor Who's never quite as weird again. And that's maybe because more recent who is of our time, so it doesn't feel quite so, the weirdness is exacerbated by the fact it's in black and white, it's from so long ago. There's something slightly scratchy and indefinable about it, even though it's restored and in good quality. It's still not quite as distinct as an HD thing would be. So as weird as you could make a modern episode, it doesn't have that weird sort of chronological distance that just makes it seem like it's a product of another world itself, which adds to its allure. But no, I'm not sad for choosing Carol Ann Ford because and Susan's weirdness, because I pick the regulars so infrequently because I do take them for granted, and I know I won't have many options, many opportunities to choose anything that Susan or Carol Ann Ford does, because I think she is rather underserved in the series, and this is a nice little echo back to the original conception of the character, which is very interesting to see, especially as we don't really have any communication between Peter R. Newman and the production team. We had no insight from David Whittaker on how he worked with Peter R. Newman, or even what he thought of him. So it was interesting to sort of think about how he might have been writing this. Did he just have the original brief and sort of went his own way, and they went, oh yeah, we like that, or was did he have instructions, or did Whittaker rewrite bits of it? I don't know. I will know when I do it for too much information, perhaps, because I have various bits and bobs that I can compare. But I'm pretty sure we don't know, which is why I made the documentary looking for Peter. We don't have much of an angle on what Newman was doing, or how he felt, or anything really, which again adds to this slightly, a bit like the Ambassadors of Death that was praised by Mark Wright and indeed others as we were going along, for its slight unknowability. Even though it exists in full and it's there for us all to see, there is just something slightly lost about the Sensorites, because we sort of always had it, but nobody was as interested in it as they were in the big hitters. If you said to a fan, right, what do you want out on video from the Hartnell era, the Sensorites would have been very low on anybody's list. And then even when we did get to see it, we'd not had an interview with the writer, we'd not had an interview with the main director, because they both died before fandom was a thing. So there's always been this slight unknowability about the Sensorites, even though it was never missing. Isn't that peculiar? And I still feel like it will never quite be a story that people fully remember. Even once they've seen it, it's almost like it goes and hides away again, like the Sensorites themselves. It's sort of, it's there and we know it's there, but it kind of prevents us from getting to know it and keeps its distance, and just lurks and doesn't say anything to us. Isn't that peculiar? Oh well, look. I hope you're well. I don't know about you, but I am very sad about William Russell. I love Ian, and I love him. I really do. And I have neighbours called Ian and Barbara. I'm sure I've said this, and that fills me with great joy. And I suppose at least our Ian and Barbara are now together, up there in the stars. But and you know what? I like the fact that we feel this loss. I like the fact that when my heroes die, even though he wasn't a friend of mine, I didn't know him. I worked with him a couple of times, and did events with him or gigs with him at the same time or whatever. But I feel very lucky to have met him. But actually, that aside, it's what he represents, is that he represents that link back to those early days, and I find it quite profound that we had this living link who could provide a conduit back to the very beginning of this thing that we love, which is so old now, and he was 99. So we had him for far longer than we, and the actor immediately above him on the credits died the year after I was born. So we've had William Russell for my entire lifetime, pretty much, longer than we had his co-star William Hartnell. Isn't life strange? Well, R.I.P. William Russell. I hope that was all right for you guys listening, and I hope that wherever you are, you're raising a glass to Mr. Chatterton. Thanks very much for listening to Happy Times and Places, which is presented by me, Toby Haydock, and my special guest this time around is Steve Lyons, writer of various Doctor Who books and audios. Avail yourself of any number of those, because he's very talented and a very witty man too. I'm grateful to Steve and to the patrons who make these podcasts possible, and they include Jason Mayo, Russell McPhillips, Stuart Mitchell, Nathan Moore, Ian Morgan, Christopher Newman, Matthew Newton, Graham Knott, Dave Owen, Adam Parkin, Melvin Pena, Jonathan Potter, Kevin Parker, Scott Pride, Dylan Rees, John Rivers, Mark Sandon, Jim Saxter, Keith Say, Graham Slate, David Shepherdson, Stephen, all small case, no surname, Neil Tate, Nick Temple, Damien Timmer, Sabrina Tirabassi, Apollo Seavermouth, and Gary Wales. The music is by Dave Gates and the artwork by Dylan Patterson. If you would like your name read out on the credits, well, that is one of the bonuses of being a patron. You can become one at patreon.com/Toby Haydock, where for as little as £3 a month, you can get advance releases, bonus material, and your own podcast just for you. Far too much information, as well as exclusive monthly AMAs and other bits and bobs. It's also a nice community there as well. You can get 10% off whatever tier you are at if you sign up for a year. But the tier thing, don't be distracted by. There's only a few sort of trivial trinkets to take you up the ladder. Everything is available. Everything of any sort of consequence in terms of, content is there at the £3 level. If you don't want to commit to a monthly thing, you can go to kofi.com/Toby Haydock anytime you want to contribute to the upkeep of these and stopping them from being ad-free or making me having to sell myself down some sort of alleyway in order to maintain the time and equipment commitments to make these things work. But if you don't want to or are unable to make a financial contribution, and I totally understand that, times are tough, and I am just grateful to you for listening. If you could go to any of your podcast providers and give these 5 stars and a few lines of review, and perhaps say lovely things on social media, that would be very helpful indeed, and I would be extremely grateful. Talking of social media, I'm on @Haydock Podcasts on Twitter. These podcasts are anyway. This is where these get plugged and pointed out and flagged, etc. But I have my own feed as well, which is @Toby Haydock, where I don't just talk about these podcasts and Doctor Who. I talk about all the other things I do, including my stand-up comedy work. And my stand-up comedy club, Excess Malarkey, which is every Tuesday in Manchester, has its own Twitter feed @Excess Malarkey. I have a Facebook page, and I'm also on Instagram @Toby.Haydock, and Excess Malarkey is on Instagram @XS, which is just the letter X or the letter S, Malarkey. Silly old fusspots. I shall miss them.